Watching live from Paris, it's good to have you with us. These are our headlines this hour. Repeating his request for $5.7 billion to build a wall along the US-Mexican border, Donald Trump stopped short of declaring a state of emergency in order to get those funds, but continued to blame Democrats for the ongoing government shutdown and says the national security crisis on the border has to be addressed. The British Parliament starts a solid 5-day debate about the divorce deal with the European Union, ahead of a vote on that next Tuesday. In another blow to Theresa May, lawmakers voted that any preparations for a no-deal Brexit has to get parliamentary approval before being carried out. And this year's Africa Cup of Nations will be hosted by Egypt, which has already welcomed the competition 4 times before. The country also home to this year's African Player of the Year, Mohamed Salah, retaining that title for the 2nd year in a row. Also coming up, we'll be taking a glimpse at the Festival of Light, currently underway in Finland. Bringing international artists and the works of local school children together, the festival is held at the height of winter when daylight there lasts only 5 hours, meaning the show can go on for that bit longer. It's not about hate, but about love. US President Donald Trump says he wants to build the wall on the Mexican border to protect those living on the US side of it, saying it's an issue of humanitarian urgency. He once again blamed Democrats for the ongoing partial shutdown of the government in the US, saying it's because they won't fund border security. But they say that it's not quite the case, adding that the president needed to stop holding Americans hostage.
In the run-up to Donald Trump's first prime-time address from the Oval Office, Americans waited to see if new measures, such as a national emergency, would be announced. But the 9 p.m. speech instead was a repetition, albeit a more somber presidential one, of his plea to build a wall on the U.S.'s southern border.
Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside.
For 9 minutes, the president described his view of the U.S.'s immigration issues. He called the border a growing humanitarian and security crisis, putting pressure on Congress to spend $5.7 billion to construct a more extensive wall. Trump shifted the blame over the partial government shutdown that the border debate has caused.
The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security.
In their rebuttal, Democratic leaders struck down Trump's misleading claims on illegal immigration.
The women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government.
Trump's next move is meeting with congressional leaders to resume negotiations as they try to end the second longest government shutdown in U.S. history. And then on Thursday, he'll head to the Texas border to push for public support of his wall.
Well, as things stand, the partial government shutdown in the US is the second longest in its history. State employees struggling now to pay their mortgages and other costs. Government-funded museums and monuments are temporarily closed. In New York, several sites were shut, much to the disappointment of tourists there. Owen Barnell has that story.
Closed for business. This, the scene at several museums across Lower Manhattan as the US government shutdown continues into its 3rd week. Tourists hoping to explore some of New York's museum attractions turned away at the door.
Yeah, we're visiting from the UK, and I'm interested in Native American culture. I was interested in going in, but he said it was shut down, so can't get in.
With hundreds of thousands of federal workers missing paychecks, government-funded Smithsonian museums have shut their doors. Closed, the National Museum of the American Indian, the Federal Hall National Memorial, and the African Burial Ground National Monument.
I mean, it's such a cool site when you think about it, but George Washington, this is where he was first inaugurated, and, you know, if you just want to learn about that, it's just a little frustrating. It's disappointing that you can't go in because of the shutdown.
Disappointing. Yeah. That's the word I'd sum it up for. And not the site itself, but it being closed. Yeah. Very disappointing.
The whole experience.
Yeah.
We're from Mexico, and we came here to New York City. We're staying in Manhattan, and we came today to visit Wall Street and all the area, but it's closed, so we're like really sad about it.
Those visiting the Big Apple will have to leave these museums off their checklists for now, as the shutdown continues, with no end in sight.
White House National Security Advisor John Bolton did not get to meet with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan during his visit there. An apparent snub by the Turks, Erdogan accusing Bolton of making a serious mistake by asking Ankara to guarantee the safety of Kurdish fighters in northeastern Syria, adding that preparations for a new military offensive against what Turkey sees as a terror group is almost complete. The reaction raising more questions over how the US can ensure safety of its allies if it pulls troops out of Syria. Some news coming in from Australia this Wednesday. Several foreign consulates in Melbourne have been evacuated, with officials saying they were responding to multiple hazardous material reports across the city, at least 10 of them. Police and fire crews have arrived to a number of diplomatic offices, including those of India, Italy, Spain and Germany. A suspicious package was also intercepted at Argentina's consulate late on Monday. It's currently being examined. The British Parliament has voted to prohibit government spending on preparations for a possible no-deal Brexit. Another defeat for Prime Minister Theresa May, and the vote a clear sign of the opposition to the idea of the UK leaving the EU with no structure in place. A vote in Parliament on whether or not to approve May's current Brexit deal is scheduled for next Tuesday. Peter O'Brien tells us more about this latest setback and the issue of preparing for that no-deal scenario.
Rehearsals, contingency plans and warnings. The UK government's list of preparations for a no-deal Brexit is growing, the latest being an exercise for easing congestion from channel crossings, with the participation of dozens of trucks.
Well, I welcome the Department for Transport ramping up Brexit preparations, but this trial is on far too small a scale. It's just about 100 lorries, when about 10,000 lorries come to the channel ports every single day.
In another measure, work has begun on Ramsgate Harbour in the southeast to get it ready for a potential no deal. The government has awarded contracts to companies to run additional freight connections, so there'd be less pressure on Dover, a move criticised after it was discovered one of the firms has never run a ferry service. Ramsgate's local councillor says the harbour won't be ready in time, and the mayor of the Belgian port it's due to connect with has warned the same thing. Meanwhile, the public is also being told what to expect.
Will my travel be affected when we leave the EU?
What about documents for driving? Will mobile roaming change?
A government radio ad refers listeners to a new website, which compiles information intended to help them prepare. In another step, around 1,000 police officers are set to be deployed in Northern Ireland to deal with potential disorder. This in addition to the 3,500 troops which will be on standby across the country.
Germany has offered to take in some of the 300 migrants rescued in the Mediterranean in recent weeks. Currently, dozens of people, including children, remain stranded at sea. 49 people rescued by 2 vessels run by German charities have been sailing back and forth along the coast of Malta for days now. Another 249 people picked up by the Maltese Navy boats in the final week of 2018. Malta says it needs other EU countries to say they're going to help before it lets ships dock. In Peru, the Attorney General has quit after being accused of hindering a corruption probe involving Brazilian construction giant Odebrecht. Peter Chavarri says he is not guilty but doesn't want anything to shadow the office of the Attorney General. He was previously accused of peddling political favour in exchange for bribes. Criticism against him grew louder after he fired 2 popular prosecutors on New Year's Eve. Yuka Royer reports.
He resisted pressure to resign for days, but has finally decided to leave. In a letter to Peru's chief prosecutors, Pedro Chavarri said he would step down as Attorney General to protect his office, portraying himself as a victim of a media campaign to oust him.
If I am the pretext for continuing these illegal acts against the institution that I represent, I have decided that it's best that I step aside. out of respect for my institution, the love of God, and my family.
Sworn in last July, Javari came under fire after he removed 2 lead prosecutors from the Odebrecht corruption probe targeting former presidents and high-profile politicians. The announcement on New Year's Eve sparked widespread outrage and street protests. He was forced to reinstate the 2 prosecutors, but investigators then turned their attention to Javari himself for alleged influence peddling and aiding criminal organizations. Javari's departure comes as a victory for President Martin Vizcarra, who's been seeking to remove him as he pushes ahead with measures that uproot the country's endemic corruption. The acting Attorney General, however, criticised legislation proposed by the President to revamp the prosecutor's office, warning it could undermine the independence of the judiciary.
Given the difficult situation facing our institution, and until the National Board of Justice is established, I declare a state of emergency in the public ministry in order to regain the confidence of citizens in our institution.
Avalos will take over for 60 days until a new Attorney General is elected.
This year's edition of the Africa Cup of Nations will be played in Egypt. The country chosen to host the Games has welcomed them already 4 times in the past. It was picked over rival South Africa. Ahmed Ahmed, president of the Confederation of African Football, tells us why.
The difference was really in the level of government commitment. But in terms of infrastructure, be it stadiums, hotels, hospitals, they're both on equal footing. But as you know, in Africa, government commitment is what matters most when it comes to organising these major sporting events.
Well, Egypt is also home to this year's African Player of the Year, Mohamed Salah, retaining the title for the 2nd year in a row. Our sports editor Kedavan Gorgistani tells us more about that award.
The Egyptian king, Mohamed Salah, was crowned the African king for the 2nd year in a row, further cementing his place among the continent's footballing greats. He becomes only the 4th man to win back-to-back titles, putting his name alongside 3 African legends, Yaya Touré, El Hadji Diouf and Samuel Eto'o. And it really caps off an incredible 2018 for Mohamed Salah, who was successful with his club, Liverpool, scoring 44 goals last season in all competition, reaching the final of the Champions League with the Reds and continuing in the first half of this season with 13 goals in the Premier League. But he was also successful with his national team, Egypt. He was a key in qualifying his country for the World Cup for the first time in 28 years, even though an injury prevented him from really helping his team during the competition in Russia. Nevertheless, Mohamed Salah is the African Player of the Year, and it was the cherry on Egypt's cake because Egypt were named the hosts of the Africa Cup of Nations for the 5th time in their history, which means that Mohamed Salah will get a chance to shine on the international stage, but this time at home in front of his fans when Egypt host that edition of the Africa Cup of Nations this coming summer.
Well, bringing international artists and the works of local school children together, an annual light festival in Finland is bringing colour to the capital. The festival held at the height of winter when daylight lasts only 5 hours, meaning the show can go on for that bit longer. It's a festival that started in 2012 and has steadily grown in popularity, organisers expecting 500,000 visitors this year.